my personal interest, and we'll talk about how I got into that, but is how to create Manchurian candidates, super spies, using cybernetic hive minds and exposing the no-touch torture tactics. I don't like to consider myself a whistleblower. I merely came forward because my research investigation from brain to computer interfacing technologies led me to a group of people that they call TIs, targeted individuals. I didn't know what they were. I didn't understand it fully, but I was shocked to find out someone beat me to this, to this ultimate technology of being able to interface with the human brain. And then this led my research down the rabbit hole to a very dark topic that most people just do not want to talk about: torture and trauma-based conditioning. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm right in the process of writing a no-touch torture report that is parallel to the Senate Intelligence Committee's report that was released recently that CIA tried to, sabotage.
Right.
And I'm showing that they're using the exact same tactics with this technology, this much more advanced technology, in secret, as they do with the physical tortures that they kept in secret and denied for many years. And that's kind of where we're at today.
Okay, and one of the most difficult things for people to understand about this technology is the sophistication of it. It makes it very difficult for people, I think, who are on the outside to have any grasp of what's actually going on because of the sophistication. Can you talk a little bit about that? EEG cloning, that type of thing.
Yeah, and this truly is the most sophisticated weapon system humanity has ever created. It involves every aspect of science. It involves tactics that are unimaginable unless you just have a devious criminal mind. And it destroys lives. It's being used on innocent people. Now, remember, in the Senate Intelligence Committee report, they said 25% of the people they tortured happened to be innocent in the end. So this is still going on, but it's just they don't want this exposed. And that is why I'm speaking forward. The sophistication is enormous. You have to understand neuroscience, you have to understand physics, you have to understand psychology, you have to understand many different aspects of all human knowledge to understand this weapon system. So I will try to break it down into simple terms as best as I can.
So how does this technology work wirelessly? Because when we're talking about Guantanamo Bay or something like that, we're talking about person-to-person interaction. How does this work?
Yeah. And that's the huge question. We're going to have to break it down into smaller parts. But even in Guantanamo Bay, you brought that up, and I researched torture, and so I've listened to the torture reports from those released from Guantanamo Bay. What did they put you through? And a lot of them began saying, I could start hearing voices after about a month of torture. Well, that's interesting. That's not something you would normally expect,
Right.
And so I studied the more advanced techniques of, how to hack a human brain. And this is about brain hacking, mind hacking. So how do you do it? Let's break it up into pieces. There are many theories up there, and I'm going to go with theories first.
Okay.
The CIA at first was caught, and I'm going to blame them the most, but the military also does it. they were implanting people with microchips, brain chips. Dr. Gil Delgado is the most famous neuroscientist of the brain chipping method. And, you know, he bragged about how he control all human behavior at 450 megahertz. And, you know, he demonstrated on a bull and many people. But then it went wireless. And a lot of people still today believe you must have a microchip in you in order for this technology to work. And the technology has advanced very far. The actual, let's just say they put an RFID chip in you to make the calculations much easier of how to triangulate on the human being and the target of interest. I would assume you'd be able to do an MRI, an X-ray, find the chip, have it removed, and you'd be free. But I haven't heard any stories like that. So I'm not a believer in the microchip theory. But the other ways you can look at, you're going to ask, well, how do you read brain waves or body electricity from a distance?
Right, yeah.
Now, if you study MRI technology, I should tell what that abbreviation stands for. That's magnetic resonance imaging or nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. We usually use, and it's a magnetic intensity in the Teslas when we go to a hospital and we get our body imaged. But we are bathed in a magnetic field called the Earth's magnetic field, and it's about 50 Gauss. And this too, you can do a what's called an Earth Gauss MRI. And there's another sister technology called electron spin resonance, ESR. And this, they don't talk about it much, obviously, because they don't want people to know. But this is a way to survey the land. This is a way to look for underground tunnels. This is, I mean, you can look towards the center of the Earth. I mean, it's really fascinating technology. And we can't get away from it. I mean, there's no point in Earth where it's zero Gauss. I suppose you could build a superconductor chamber, but you'd be living in a prison in liquid nitrogen temperatures, and you could never work or live in that sort of way. So it does get very complex, and then you're going to ask me probably about, well, then how do they affect the human body, the human mind, the human nervous system? That's a great question.
How they affect it, and also how do they use that radiation that we are bathed in? How do they? What's the implementation of that? Do they use satellites?
Let's just say I knew the answer to that. I would absolutely not be able to tell you where the sensors are located. But I'm not confirming nor denying. But let me say it's multimodal. It's all integrated. There are land-based, sea-based, air-based
so we could be talking
systems.
About ionospheric heaters.
HARP, yeah, that's right. HARP actually came on in 1991, and quite interestingly, in the research, and I probably interviewed 1,000 targets. There were more that came online at that time. Every time the military gets a bigger budget, especially after 9/11, more targets came online, and they all give the exact date when they came online. And so it shouldn't be a big surprise, but these ionospheric heaters, there are about 18 of them in the world that we know of anyway. And satellites came on later, and they're probably redundant systems. But people want to look at Gwen towers and other arrays, and it's just difficult because they're all interrelated. You can't just point to one. There is no single source of the energy. And so that comes to another question. People will ask, can I get a meter reading in my house and triangulate on where the source is coming from?
Right.
Well, what if it is like GPS coming from multiple directions, and they call it holography. It was one of my theses in college, that the interfering waves only triangulate upon one point, but you can do, and I'm going to lose your listeners here, an inverse Fourier transfer and create multiple points, literally a hologram of intensity of people on the planet. So they want to know, how do you target more than one person? Well, my minimal calculation that I've done so far, just from the density population, the people who come forward on the internet, is there are 2,000 in the United States. There could be more. And then 10,000 worldwide, just based on the population density. And so they're testing the scalability of this weapon system.
One of the claims that's made is that there's an ability, a capacity to actually read minds from a distance. Now that sounds super far out. What do you say to that?
Yes, it does sound very far out. And what I can say is, under the right circumstances, there was, see his name, it's escaping me. He's a famous Department of Defense contractor. Anyway, he did psychic warfare type activity. He did it through another means, not the ones we're talking about. And he had another buddy that was that has a security clearance, and he said secrets began to slip. So I like that term, because mind reading is not, it's not black and white. It's not binary. I can read every thought you have right this moment. It's some secrets slip, and under the exact right circumstances, yes, you will get slight visual images. You'll be able to hear what the other person is thinking, due to the EEG cloning, and what they're speaking. You might be able to smell what they're smelling, but it's not binary. It's like it has to be the right circumstances for that cloning to have a good effect.
Okay, so what does it take? Let's go back really quick. Sorry about that, but let's go back really quick. What does it take to actually lock onto a target? Do they have to decode somebody's energy signature? How exactly does that work?
Yeah, you're asking great questions, and I got to be careful what I say. But yes, it does seem that a localized search for that particular target needs to be done first. So a lot of the targets that I've interviewed, they lived in apartment buildings, for example, and then people move in above and beside them, and they can hear large equipment being wheeled around. And so it would appear that initially the person's brain print, their particular energy signature, just like a thumbprint or something like that, needs to be collected before the long process of retraining the brain to listen to another human being's brain or a computer. And I guess we'll get into that too.
Okay, so there's a process. You're talking about the initial process seems to require possibly
a localized
hardware person.
Yeah, sensor system. Yeah.
A sensor system. So then it's recording that person's data, and that person, the link is being established so that person's brain is sort of getting acclimated, maybe unconsciously, to.
Very good. I like that word, acclimated.
And yes, Okay, and then over time, the distance, once the target's energy signature is figured out, then it can be done.
Yes, it's irrelevant almost anywhere on planet Earth.
And I imagine you were talking about brain reading just a minute ago. I imagine that over time it would become more easy to read, or easier to read an individual's brain, because their brain patterns would correspond to particular thoughts. Is that?
You got it. Excellent explanation, better than I could say it. So you imagine you have two neural networks, and it's a field of study that I've done quite a bit, and they're trying to learn each other. They're trying to communicate. And let me give this analogy. You have a spouse. After a long time, you can complete each other's sentences, right. And that's the kind of confirmation you're trying to get.
So it's like it grows with you, though.
It grows with you. It learns with you. Yeah, absolutely. And that it's also why these experiments are lifelong generally, not always, but they're they're trying to grasp all sorts of data from how effective can we make them kill each other themselves to can we make them do stupid stuff like wrap their cat in tin foil, make them think that the energy is coming from there. I have one interview I had.
Oh,
and,
man.
Well, that's false correlation. And so in order to disrupt the mind, you got to remember this is called offensive information warfare technology. So it's just like hacking a computer. You are trying to crash that computer. You're trying to crash that human being. And you map out all of the motivations we have, primitive motivations, due to genetics, as well as the cultural motivations. And then you try to manipulate them by messing with those buttons. And that can include altering emotions, which are very important to our behavior. And so they call these emotional signature clusters. And you can read them quite clearly. This isn't classified information. There are a bunch of top universities studying this, that you can put someone in a functional MRI and you can see what emotional state they're in quite easily, and you can determine if they're drunk or on drugs or on anything else, and you can tell these brain patterns in a generalized fashion. And so you can imagine what the future police will look like. I mean, if you can read everyone's mind and you determine, he's drunk, we're going to prosecute him and torture him and reprogram his behavior or whatever it might be.
Yeah, especially if we're talking about doing it without putting someone in a scanner or putting electrodes on their head.
Yeah, exactly. This is over the entire population. And so they're increasing this, and a lot of people won't believe me, and that's fine. But they're increasing this. They are scaling this technology to the entire population. And so it's going, when people are awakened, they'll find out that 1984 did happen. We're actually further ahead.
So if we can talk about reading minds, reading emotions, and then we can talk about overlaying or altering brainwaves, overlaying personalities or moods, whatever, with different states, with the states of the controller, let's say. How would something like that work?
Again, you're diving into the deep stuff, which a lot of people might not believe, but so emotional signature clusters. Okay, some people might believe that. You can re-entrain the macro and micro circuitry of people's brains. We aren't all that different. I mean, we're different enough that we have a unique brain signature, but we are human beings, and so we have a lot of the same circuitry. And so you can dial into this circuitry on certain parts of the brain. They will entrain based on the exact key of those circuits. And I like to talk about emotions as the seven dwarves from the Wizard of Oz. You got happy, you got Doc, and it's a way to understand the way we, for example, see colors. We actually only have 3 cones in our eyes. You see red, green, and blue. But our brain perceives rainbows, all these mixtures from those 3 signals. Well, it's the same with emotions. It looks like we can get it down to 7 levers, and we can create all the emotional states that we can by manipulating those 7 levers. Now, in terms of mind reading and brain reading, it goes back to what you said before. This takes time. This takes a computer to actually do the transformation from one brain to another, that every word you say, and then they have a set vocabulary, and they start testing the words out, and then after a time, most human beings have a vocabulary of about 1,000 words, 5,000 words max. Shakespeare had 11,000 words. And once your vocabulary is mapped out, well, then they can put it on the automated mode, what are called chatterboxes, something that I worked on to keep the human being talking in perpetuation, basically to a machine, thinking it's a real human being. And they do this to scale, automate a lot of the degradation in the torture process, the breaking down of the will. But as well as you need this to keep the lock on of the signal. I mean, if you break the signal in some fashion, music, for example, can do that temporarily, but your brain always goes back to its natural patterns. And so they got you. Once they have your brain patterns matched, they got you. You can't escape that very easily.
Okay, so you're saying they have these, so the chatterbox is the computer talking to you.
That's correct. And so this is the most important weapon system that the United States, and I assume Russia and China, are developing. But, I really came out to speak because I'm disgusted that this is being done to my own citizens. I did not agree to work on these programs for that purpose, and so I just had to reiterate that.
Yeah.
This is actually real ESP. I don't know what the magical thing is, but you are literally creating new senses that the brain recognizes it. And this may be another human being, maybe a computer. And the Navy, I did some research with the Navy, for example. You can put tactile sensors on the tongue, grayscale tactile sensors that matched up with an image of a camera of divers with sonar. And now they blind the divers, and the same parts of the brain light up under functional MRI with the tactile sensors as if the diver can see. They can see through their tongue. We rewired the brain. And so this is what extrasensory perception is. We're rewiring the brain so they actually have more inputs. Now, there's a cost to that. If you put more senses in, you're taking away from your other senses, and that's what we notice in our research. But, we've all heard of people who have been blinded in a car accident or something.
They can hear better.
All of a sudden their hearing becomes sharper, their taste becomes sharper, and that's because the brain reorganizes, uses those neurons for more distinguishing power. They're getting rewired. They will never be the same human being again, especially if they're under the trauma-based program. Torture trauma never leaves anyone the same. I remember some Guantanamo Bay prisoners being released, and their lawyers are like, they're sluggish schizophrenics. We can't even help them. The brains are fried, and in the Guantanamo Bay or the torture memos, I remember John Beebe or John Yu and Beebe, or I forget their first names. They were the lawyers who actually gave the permission for the CIA to go forward with this under the Bush administration, and they said not until organ failure. So can you call a brain that is just scrambled organ failure? Is it called torture?
Still working, I guess.
Words is just horrendous, and it bothers me so much. There's not
to the extreme.
Yeah, it's just to the extreme, and so there is under our government no such thing as torture, basically. I'm going to go through some examples.
Okay.
And these are real life examples, and I never use names. I've made sure that through all my research, that in case I'm raided by the FBI or anything, that they're not going to find any names of contacts or whatnot. I want to protect people. Mutilation is a common form of torture. There are a couple of TIs that they tricked into believing, because they heard voices, that they had a microchip implanted in their tooth. So those individuals pulled out all their teeth.
Oh, that's awful.
It's awful, but it's self-mutilation. So you can see the rationalization. We made them do it to themselves. This isn't torture. What's another example? Oh, I know a doctor. They've done this to a few doctors who poked out his eardrums, thinking there was some sort of microchip in there, and literally poked them out with a Q-tip and whatnot. So they can make people through the trickery to harm themselves, and that's part of so-called no-touch torture. We didn't do it. You did it to yourselves. And they, of course, especially with this voice to skull, which we haven't talked about quite yet, but being able to pipe voices into someone's head, you have the traditional breakdown, the threats to the family, friends, we're going to kill you, we're going to kill your family, tell us who you work for, or do what we say, and et cetera. And it's a complete breakdown. One of the two worst, I would say, are probably sleep deprivation. All TIs complain about that they're forced to stay up for 5 days and then forced to sleep 2 days. And that's their week period. And, that's a common torture practice. Stress positions, they get the TI to believe if they hold like pots and pans in a certain direction, north or south or whatever, and hold it there for hours and hours, they won't get tortured, the pain stimulus. Now, a lot of people are like, well, how can they pipe pains into your head? And this gets very complicated. So we can start out with the non-classified stuff, which is active denial of service. And that's a 95 gigahertz platform built by Raytheon that works for a kilometer and a half. And the Marines asked for it in the Gulf War, and they wouldn't even give it to them. Michael Wynn of the Air Force said we have to use it on our own citizens before we will use it in the battle. He got fired for that comment. But,
just because he made it public, probably.
Yeah, just because he made it public, but that's the way they think.
Yeah.
And so and that's one way. And so it makes you feel like you're on fire. And then there are other techniques, many different megahertz. And remember, we were talking about cloning, brain heterodyning is the actual word, which means modulation of other brain signals within yours. So it's almost like two people are living in the same head or more. You can get up to 4 people without it becoming schizophrenic.
Really? Four different
people all living in the same brain space.
Different emotions, the whole thing?
Yeah, it's actually good. It's good for creative processes and thinking, but if you get more than 4, then it becomes dysfunctional, like a meeting that no one shuts up in.
Are we talking about a hive mind? Right. Are we talking about a hive mind configuration, or are we talking about multiple personalities in one person?
No, a hive mind configuration, which is kind of the same thing. So multiple personalities, the CIAs were experimenting on, and I don't know the true purpose of this, but they would use torture to try to split young girls' minds, to create sex slaves, honeypots as spies, and they want them as couriers, so they don't remember what information they told, whatever informant they were supposed to tell, and that kind of thing. I don't know if that technology was related to this current technology that I study, which is cybernetic hive minds. And it's really fascinating because there's so much potential for good. And I know we haven't talked about any of the good, and I study most of the bad. But we can think of ourselves. I like this futurist who said we are bluing as a culture, and by what he meant by that is the frequency of fiber optic cables that went from red to blue. Higher the frequency, more information you can transmit through a fiber optic pipe. Well, the whole human race is going through this. Is that we started with snail mail, and now we're up to email. And it's going to continue. We will be at the speed of thought eventually, and then faster than that. You can imagine past that. And so this global brain is what's developing, a worldwide brain. We always think of ourselves, well, we have a sense of self, but that's just not true. And Einstein said that as well. We actually are composed of smaller portions of our brain, smaller subsections, and these they are not aware that they're not part of something bigger. Neither are we aware that we're part of something larger, a larger consciousness, and we'll call it the collective human race or whatever it may be. And, and that's just the way it works. We just happen to communicate rather than through neural signals. We communicate through speech and video and whatnot. But
this technology is accelerating this process of a global brain.
Absolutely is. And in fact, Google's already talking about it. And also the president of Google are talking about, we're going to have a chip in our brain to have access to the internet. And absolutely, that's going to come to pass. I mean, that's a given. And people will desire it. People will need it in order to compete in the workforce or whatever it may be. But it's going to happen.
Now, is it possible to connect people to these databases wirelessly without a chip? Or do you think?
It's a little more difficult. Another great question. And, you're asking all the right questions, and I don't know if your listeners will believe it. Not quite. Not quite. Right now, you have to do it through a third person. So you're in a cybernetic hive mind. And let's use The Matrix as an example. It was a great movie. You're on the battlefield and you request, I need instructions to fly this helicopter. That person would have to pull it up and bring it into their knowledge before it would transfer to the target's knowledge.
Okay, that confuses me just a little bit because we were talking about chatterboxes, which is a connection with a computer that's talking to you. So why can't the person using his consciousness query the computer?
Oh, I suppose that's possible. I just don't know if that's being done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, for sure.
Some historical data or something.
Yeah. Please access Oracle database.
Right. Send me that information.
Yeah, no, you're right. That could be done. Right now, natural language processing, I studied under Barbara Gross at Harvard and some MIT professors. It's getting there. It's getting there, but the knowledge platform just isn't that good. And that's how I tell TIs, well, tell me what you're listening to. Does it sound repetitive? Does it remember anything you say? And et cetera. And so when you query these artificial intelligence bots, you can recognize them within 15 minutes. I'm not talking to a real human being.
Right. Do you think most TIs are talking to at this point to AI or
some fraction. Yeah, I would.
Okay.
Yeah, either fraction of the day or for weeks on time, and they monitor that. They determine, is this working? Is it keeping them spinning and looping forever in these nonsensical conversations, or we need to have a real person step in for now and get them back.
Okay. And why are they doing this to people? Just studying, just making a weapon.
And that's right. So it's making a weapon system, and that's what we've always done. We have to be ahead of anybody else, and you got to remember how many times both the military and the CIA have been caught experimenting on our own citizens, and they used to use the downtrodden, the black community mostly, and
inmates too.
Yeah, and inmates and anybody they just no one would care about.
Right.
And so they use them for these, drug testing programs and et cetera. But it seems that they've expanded this program to include people from all walks of life, the rich, the poor, the educated, and from every language. It's gone global because this is it's the ultimate weapon, total totalitarian state. That you don't even have control of your own mind and you believe your thoughts are your own. I mean, it's better than subliminals, although they use those, but literally altering your brain states without your permission. There are other reasons as well as a lot of it has to do with interrogation. The CIA claims torture works. Now, they're talking about physical torture. Now, no touch torture is a whole new topic, a whole new category. Most people don't believe it's happening. You can be tortured in your own home. No one will believe you. But it's interrogation and torture has a lot of purposes. And for example, let's say I'm a terrorist and they're torturing me with this no-touch torture tactic. I'm going to run to all my support groups, and they get to see, who am I contacting? Who are those people? Help me. I'm being tortured. Save me. And so it's a way to ferret out these kind of terrorist groups. It's used, in a lot of TIs talk about the Jeff and Mutt, the good cop, bad cop tactic that they use with them for interrogation. And so I try to teach these interrogation tactics to these TIs so they know at least what's going on with them. And one of the techniques that they're practicing is they give a group, and we'll call them the psychic warriors. How's that? We'll call them the psychic warriors. Okay. Give them a good name. Yeah. And they're trying to figure out what the bad guy knows, and these are the innocent Americans.
Okay, and the psychic warriors are the DoD.
Yeah, you put names. So yeah, that's right. And so the psychic warriors, they want to. They're not given any information, just a little bit about the subject. And the NSA and the other agencies, they have everything about this individual. So they have proof of what this individual's life is about. So these handlers or psychic warriors are trying to get as much information from the target as they can by walking them back through their history. Well, you told us this. We know this about you. And making them erase their memory. These are old tactics. They're used physically as well with drugs and stuff. But this can be done now with this new cybernetic warfare technology. And they try to get every little bit of information from you and find out if it's true. So they get scored on it. Well, how did I do in the end? Whenever the project ends after a couple of years, and they get scored on it. Now, this is called hyper game theory. It goes beyond that. John Nash of A Beautiful Mind, there's a movie about that. He won a Nobel Prize in game theory, which is used in business and is used in warfare quite a bit. Well, it's gone beyond that to hyper game theory, and a professor at Dartmouth has a paper published. People like to understand the mathematics of that. And it's the basic gist of it is to see, how do you make someone walk down a certain path? So you're playing a chess game, a multi-dimensional chess game. How do you make a rational player walk them to their death, or walk them into jail, or commit a crime? And so they want to see, out of all these people that we're targeting, okay, the first logical thing they do is go to the police. Well, the police can't help you. They don't know anything. They're going to give you a lockup and 72 hours and a psych ward. I know, then they go to the FBI, and there are only maybe a few FBI agents that know about this. This isn't within their classification, and so they do what they're supposed to do, and they write petitions, and they try to write the congressman and president and stuff. And what they're doing is they're figuring out, how do you shut all this information down? What are people going to try so we can shut it down? And this will never be exposed or released. And that's called the hyper game theory. And they also do it, in more minute manners of just making. I remember one TI. Let me give this story. One TI that they put on a useless mission. They said, "We have miscalculated the census in Montreal, Canada. Would you please count people?" And he did it. So, it's just It's a game, and
Or
it's
yeah.
funny if it's not your life and your life is not being destroyed.
Yeah.
It's humorous to look at what they can trick people into doing, but this is torture, and I want there to be no doubt about it. This is torture, destruction of life, and destruction to misery for all these people, and it's a war crime. And it's crime against humanity for sure. And there isn't much more to say about it.
Let's go back to how I want to discuss a little bit more about how personalities and emotions and states can actually be put into somebody. How does that work? Have they cataloged brain patterns? Is that what it is?
Yeah, you got it. And so they're cataloging and classifying brain patterns, which can be transformed and transmitted into other human beings. So they're testing that as well. And let me give you an example that a lot of TIs go through. They will say something like, "I'm stabbing you in the back. Can you feel that?" And the TI will be like, "Yes, I feel that." And then they'll give it a score. Okay, how much misery and suffering did that cause? And all that's being done is being played back into the brain, the central nervous system. It's not an actual physical touch. There was no harm being done in terms of the physicality of the individual, but they'll go through these like 3 a day different tortures. Okay, we're gassing your eyes with tear gas, and their eyes will actually tear up. There will be a response, and they'll itch and they can't see. But this is all done through the brain. It's the brain's reaction to these tortures that they're applying back to them.
So the brain feels the pain as if it's real.
That's right. We call it no-touch torture, and so the assumption for most human beings, well, if I don't see blood or mutilation, it can't be that bad. Well, what the brain perceives is far worse than that. In fact, the pains are amplified, sensitized, and are extremely vulnerable to these circuits being stimulated. But I am going to say the heart is also another form of an electrical system in the human being, and there are several glands that are connected to the brain, such as the adrenaline gland, that if you stimulate certain portions of the brain, you can cause a remote control heart attack. And this was written about by the Russians in 1970. And it will cause heart damage over time for sure. But if you have any sort of weakness, they can cause a stroke, they can cause a heart attack. So I don't want to say these are completely non-lethal weapons.
Well, yeah, if it's possible to induce a heart attack, that's quite potentially lethal, certainly damaging.
Yeah, certainly damaging, and over time, and torture itself, it's a high stress level. So one of the objectives of torture is to keep them at maximum pain and the highest stress levels possible, and all of that cortisol running through your bloodstream for, in a lot of cases, years on end, that you're ready to die and they're going to kill you, it creates all sorts of cardiovascular diseases and tertiary diseases on top of that I won't go into. But yeah, it's a horrible process, and it has many damaging effects. And I think Dick Cheney should be held responsible, one, and General Hayden and Rumsfeld.
Among others.
Amongst many others, yes, that we could mention.
And what kind of control over physiology is possible, if any?
Well, I mentioned one, heart rate.
Heart.
They can. Go ahead.
What about limbs and that kind of thing?
Oh, okay. So you're getting into another area. So partially the motor cortex can be mapped. Not very well, but it can be. And so a lot of TIs will complain of, jerking and movements that they do not intend. The voices will tell them, spill your coffee, and then their limb spills their coffee. Yeah. So they have some control, but not a lot. Now, the hypnosis and the cerebral cortex, when it's cloned, and you're under a perfect hypnotic state, they can take control of your urges. So if your urge is, I'm going to pull out a knife and stab myself in the chest, they can almost do that. But if you talk to a lot of psychologists and others, most people can break it. I will not harm myself. The primary program will always override those kind of urges. But yeah, it can be done under the right circumstances.
Okay, so it's not a situation necessarily yet, at least, where they can take control over somebody's body completely when they're in a conscious state and walk them, or against their will.
I get where your question's going. Now, the CIA did a lot of the experimentation. This was brought out in the MK Ultras, the church committee hearings, and they were able, in some of the research, to get a woman who they had hypnotized, somehow split her personality. I don't know the details how they did that. Wake up in the middle of the night, point a gun at her friend, and click the trigger. Now, the gun wasn't loaded. Go back to sleep or whatever, and wake up. And then they interviewed her. Do you remember anything that happened last night? No, I don't. So they were able to do that in a physical setting. I don't know that that's ever been done per se and by these cybernetic hive minds in cloning.
That makes me think, though, of murders have been committed under the influence of Ambien, for instance, unconscious murders. And so I wonder, do you think if it's possible using electromagnetics to mimic drugs and drug effects, I wonder if...
You're absolutely right. And you're spot on again with all your questions. They have been mimicking, I'm going to estimate, CIA has about 20 drugs they use for brainwashing and truth-telling. Scolopamine, I think, is one of their favorites, which is called the devil's breath, and that creates a zombie that the person will literally rob themselves if you ask them to. They're in a hypnotic state. And yes, all these drugs, for the most part, can be mimicked through this technology, e.g. heterodyning. And that's what they've been working on. And they're perfecting it. I'm just here to testify.
So we don't have too much time left. So what's the hope for this situation? Is there any?
I got asked that question. I did a South Korea news interview last week in San Francisco. What is the hope here? Well, the hope, first, all technologies are used by the military complex. We had nuclear weapons and we had nuclear energy. Technology is neutral, so we're gonna find good uses for these. And imagine you could quit smoking or lose weight, and you have more control over your own mind, and you're the one in control of what you want to feel that day. A mood management. I want to feel good, or I want to go to sleep now. So you can see the positive aspects that will occur, but. That's my goal, is you got to take this out of the hands of the military plight and put it in the hands of the civilians, and we'll find the good uses for this technology.
Okay, and so one of the steps in that process is awareness.
Awareness, that's right. We got to keep speaking about it and make people care. And because a lot of people, they work so hard and they have families and they just want to watch sports, and they really can't get into these topics that are going to affect their children and future generations in our country and humanity as we define it. And it's very important. It's very important.